We now have Tech on here with us, so we have the support we need. I think we'll go ahead and start. I'm seeing people come in. I want to start by saying thanks everybody for joining us. I am Ian Thomas Tafoya, again, the Colorado State Director for Green Latinos. Today, we're going to be talking about investments in our community. The passage of the infrastructure bill and possibly the Build Back Better agenda means trillions of dollars are coming to states and localities. These dollars will be dispersed via contracts for transportation projects, superfund cleanups, water projects, clean energy installation, upgrading of buildings, and many more infrastructure policies. But it won't be a just transition if these dollars don't result in projects that, one, benefit our communities, and if they aren't constructed by minority-owned businesses. So today we're going to be having a conversation about how these dollars will be channeled to ensure that we build wealth and resiliency in our communities, and what you can do to advocate for our community. So I just want to take a second to go over really quickly what is in the bipartisan infrastructure bill that had passed. Delivering clean water to Americans and eliminating lead service lines, ensuring that Americans have access to reliable high-speed internet, repairing and rebuilding roads and bridges with a focus on climate crisis mitigation, resiliency, equity, and safety for all users, improving transportation options for Americans so they can reduce their dependency on fossil fuel emitting vehicles with the largest investment in public transit history, and upgrading our airports, ports for our supply chains, investing in rail line creation, and a national network of EV chargers. But it's not it. Like we said, there's so much more that has to do with tackling Superfund and brownfield sites, closing and capping wells, and improving our overall delivery of clean energy for our communities. If you were just listening to the previous conversation with climate advisor Gina McCarthy from the White House, she really emphasized this conversation about the Environmental Justice 40. Biden's administration last year laid out a path to reach the environmental justice goal of 40% of these resources and benefits from all government agencies making it back to state, local, and tribal governments that are disproportionately impacted and have been harmed by polluting industries for far too long. So I'm really happy today to have two of my friends from Colorado who work on the local level to ensure that these kind of resources come back to our communities. You're going to hear from two speakers here, Veronica Barella, who for years served as the director of NewsEd, a community development corporation. It's a nonprofit community-based organization that provided a holistic approach to rebuilding the community and whose main focus was on the revitalization of Denver's near West Side community and its commercial strip of Santa Fe Drive. For those not familiar with Denver, this West Side is a historically Chicano community and actually became the first Chicano heritage site in our city and in the country just this last year. Veronica has been recognized for her skills in community-based economic development, community organizing, retail and housing development, events, arts and culture, and her civil rights work. She absolutely has done so much from founding of the largest Cinco de Mayo event in the country and the founding of the local civil rights awards. And actually, I didn't know this one, Veronica, that a former mayor had declared June 26, 1992, Veronica Barella Day. So you've had so much service. Your bio doesn't even talk about how you've run for office multiple times to represent our voices for the people. Veronica, do you want to just take a few minutes to talk about anything else that I missed there?
No, I just wanted to thank you for asking me to be on this great program you've put together, this great conference. And did you, I could talk a little bit of history about my civil rights work if you'd like.
Sure, go ahead.
5 minutes, okay. I was with NewsEd, CDC for 40 years and retired almost 3 years ago. And during that time, we created a holistic approach to revitalizing Santa Fe Drive and the West Side community with sort of a tunnel vision to revitalize Santa Fe Drive, which we did. And now we have a premier art district on Santa Fe Drive where we get thousands of people down there for First Friday. But on the civil rights side, I was president of Hispanics of Colorado, the People of Color Coalition, which I helped put together. I now chair the Committee for City and Airport Fairness, which I have done for many years. And I'm also a board member. I used to be a co-chair of the Colorado Latino Forum, where Ian is one of the co-chairs now. The younger group, it's important that we empower them and get them out there. And so with the CAF and there's another group, and I'm not going to tell you the acronym because I can't remember it, but there was a group of us that helped save West High School because they were going to close it down. And we met for 7-8 years and actually did save West High School. Now, it was 2 academies, and so it was 2, so now when you graduate from West High School, you graduate from West High School. So we were real proud of that. Got the charter schools out of there, and now it's a functioning school. But anyway, that's just a little bit about me. And I love the work I do. I still do a lot of civil rights work. And I transitioned from NewSed to an organization called the Denver Metro Fair Housing Center. And, we advocate and enforce fair housing laws for protected classes. So I'm still doing, that kind of work. And so that's a little bit about me.
Well, thank you so much, Veronica. I don't know many people who retire and then take another job. And so I think we're all so grateful for the work you do in the community. You weren't able, I don't think, to be part of the conversation earlier, but we showed a video about the West High blowouts. And so we showed a video from Los Mocochetes. So for those who were tuned in earlier to that part of the conversation, the high school that she's talking about, my grandfather went there, my father went there, my parents went there. So that's the school that Veronica's talking about. Here on the line, too, we have another good friend of mine, Jenny Malpietti, who lives in Denver, Colorado, and currently works for a local school district, Denver Public Schools, as the outreach coordinator for the Office of Business Diversity. She oversees diverse business outreach efforts along with developing and implementing engagement programs. For the past 10 years, Jenny has worked in the diverse business community, becoming deeply passionate about removing institutional barriers and examining the effectiveness of current inclusion efforts. Prior to her current role, Jenny worked for a local affiliate of a national minority certification organization, becoming familiar with a variety of supplier diversity programs offered and how they differ from municipality to a Fortune 100 company. After reviewing existing programs and policies, she decided to focus her efforts on local diversity inclusion programming to ensure end users of public programs and community members are advocated for and protected. She specializes in working with small, minority, and women-owned business. She's honored to serve her community and believes in sharing her knowledge. Currently, she serves as an executive coach for Mountain Plains Minority Supplier Development Council's Center of Excellence Programming, specializing in Tier 2 contractor engagement. Jenny's accomplishments are a lot, and we're so lucky to have her because she's is also the public information officer for the Martin Luther King Jr. Parade. And so she was very busy over the last couple of weeks preparing for the annual gathering of people in our community. Jenny also comes from a strong political family, with her mother actually serving as the chair of the Regional Transportation District, our largest transportation district in Colorado. So we grew up around each other. My mother's known Veronica for a long time. And so it's really a family affair here today. And I have learned so much from them about how we ensure these dollars actually make it to our community, because we might advocate and say we need bike lanes or more trees planted, or we want these neighborhoods to get pipes first. But how do we ensure, again, that the things are built in our community for and by our community? But since you're both community activists, I'm wondering if we could just take a few minutes to talk about any tips you might have in advocating for the policy you want in your community, like the step before they're spending the money, like what they're going to spend the money on. So do you want to start, Jenny?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for having me. I am so excited to be here. Being here with friends from the Colorado community is really an honor. I was telling Veronica before the group joined us today, as I like to tell her frequently, I stand on her shoulders. So it's been a group effort, a community effort that's continuing to grow. And we have a lot of work left to do, but we really have accomplished quite a bit. And I'm honored to continue that legacy. So in terms of tips in engaging with infrastructure development from an owner agency perspective, I think the biggest thing is education. Make sure you're educating yourself. Know the Freedom of Information Acts. So if you're working with an owner agency, if it's a city, municipality, if it's a local school district, if it's an airport, you want to be able to request that information to know what's worked well for businesses in the past, or potentially what you could do or how you could service those organizations. I think for the purpose of our conversation here today, though, really engaging with those points of contact, know who your community advocates are. So finding the Veronicas and the Jennies and the Ians, because we're truly here to help you, help navigate you through those processes. I'm curious to see the insight that Veronica has to offer us, and potentially I can offer more as we build upon it. But I really would, Veronica and I were chatting earlier, and I'm curious and excited to hear the tips that she has for the crowd today.
I think it's really important that that organizations are created for this very purpose, and they keep their eye on the prize when it comes to helping business get certified. And particularly we do a lot of work with the airport, Denver International Airport. Way back when the convention center was being built, which is many years ago, Robert Alvarado and Linda Alvarado were the contractors on it with Hensel Phelps. That's the big construction company. And they brought them in. What you see a lot of, you don't see a lot of primes that are people of color contractors, although they're capable of doing it. But anyway, what we were noticing is there was not one black worker on the convention center site, nor any black contractors whatsoever. So Robert Alvarado and Walter Jones and myself put together the Minority Association of Contractors. And that really helped get contractors into various jobs that the city was doing, or the state. And so it's really critical that you put those kind of organizations together, and you include all people of color in them. Not just the black community or the brown community or the Asian community or the Indian community. It should be a combination. That's why I advocated so hard for the People of Color Coalition, because we had a co-chair from each ethnic group. And we did a lot with the city and a lot of the disparate things that were going on with the city. And then when they started building the airport, same thing happened. So we created the Committee for Airport Fairness, which later became the Committee for City and Airport Fairness, which I chair. And we are always meeting with, especially the airport and DPS. And, now we're going to start meeting with RTD because of all these infrastructure funds that are coming in. It's so critical with these infrastructure funds that are coming in, because there's billions and billions and billions of dollars, where they're going to put it, especially out at DIA. Where are you going to put these funds? They couldn't answer the question last time we met with them, but they did talk about the amount of dollars that are coming in. And it's really important because it's got, they're all environmental dollars coming in, and they have to use them that way. And so Green Latinos needs to be at the table with these issues, because they need to follow these guidelines from the federal government, that's what they're going to do with them. We don't quite know how, maybe DIA will use it on the Great Hall, because they're, that thing got flubbed up so bad and they need the money. But, with the buses and the electric and, and both with DPS, it's really, really important. One of the things that CAF did several years ago is we really, forced DPS to do a disparity study. They'd never done a disparity study, and they didn't really have an MWBE program. And so we talked them into doing a disparity study. They created they didn't really create an MWB program. I mean, they had goals, but what they did was create a small business enterprise, which encompasses 95% of small businesses. So we really had to talk them into doing that MWBE program. So the negotiations started all over again. And so what's important is that you are constantly dealing with these entities, these government agencies, or the quasi-public entities. One of the things we find over and over and over and over again is that, you could be at the door kicking it in, but, these government agencies and city agencies give these contracts to the same people over and over and over again. And a lot of them meet their MWBEs by giving a lot of contracts to white women, particular in the professional fields like engineering and architects. And so we really have to be vigilant about that. With DIA, we advocate a lot for the ACDBs out there. Those are airport concessions disadvantaged business enterprises. So there you got the MWBEs and the ACDBEs. And it's so important that we stay vigilant on this all the time. One of the reasons we resurrected CAF was because during one of our mayor's reign, the concessionaires went from 40% down to 25%. I'm talking about local concessionaires. And so we resurrected CAF and renamed it. And as a result of that, they were working on the Marriott out there, the new hotel. And we saw the concession numbers go from 25% up to over 45%. And I think that if we hadn't been there at the table all the time, we were meeting with the director of the airport every 2 weeks to change this picture that was going on out there. Same thing with DPS. I know we drive them crazy. I know we drive you crazy, but it's really important that we're at the table. But anyway, I think that's the strategy behind making sure that these dollars, these infrastructure dollars, get put into our community. And that's not going to be easy because like these entities just give to the same contractors.
Yeah, I think that
it can't be that way. And it is so frustrating. Oh yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off of that because Monica's bringing up some excellent points here. So without that external pressure, there's never going to be any change. And that's why I always thank Veronica. But without their work, the program as exists, as I'm able to continue to develop, wouldn't be here today. And so I think it's incredibly important to be able to participate in those organizations, to have those voices, and then also for people to be inside. So on the other side of the coin, we're working internally, we're continually questioning those choices. We're continuing to build the programs to be at the table to make sure that those decisions are taking place correctly. But the biggest thing I've been noticing lately is the community engagement. So let's take the airport, for example. They have a mechanism where the community can participate in the actual evaluation process, where we have a chance to get the community voice into that particular mechanism where they're selecting those companies and really change that up. But we're not seeing the community engagement. In fact, I had a meeting with one of their outreach coordinators yesterday, brainstorming on how can we see better disparity or better diversity within demographics, because primarily the people who are volunteering to read and evaluate these RFPs are white males. And so we're seeing a lot of those same decisions being made because that's who's scoring them, right? And so I think not only do we need external advocates like Veronica, like CAF, like the different contractors associations, not only in Colorado, but across the country. We need people inside the organizations, because I will be candid with you guys, it is not easy when you are building these types of programs and you're working through change management and working with types schedules and low budgets, but it is possible. And we really need that community support. So when you're talking about how do we advocate for infrastructure, is support your community engagement. Go out there, find those opportunities. Recently here in Denver, we have an empowerment initiative that redid the city ordinance. So it was a huge undertaking by the CEI committee, but they were able to provide real-time recommendations and to provide that with community feedback together. Because quite frankly, and I hate to say it so bluntly, but these decisions are being made. And if you're not a part of that conversation, they're still going to be made. They're just going to be made without you.
Well, I really appreciate both what you're sharing there. What I heard was you have to stay on the government. If you want to see the changes, you got to say, we're meeting again in 2 weeks. We're meeting again in 2 weeks. We're meeting again in 2 weeks. Jenny, I actually wanted to do a whole session on open records requests, because open records requests, I have heard from so many, is some of the only way that you get a peek into the inside of any sort of process. So you're just making me think we need to do that one again. You know, Veronica, you threw out some words there like prime contractor. And in your bio, Jenny, we read about second contractor. And in the chat here, we see we have member Esther, who does this work from a neighboring state, but not everybody does this work. So could you all maybe talk to us about what happens? A council or a board says, okay, we're going to authorize spending this amount of money on a project. What comes next, Jenny?
Okay, so the procurement process can vary from organization to organization, but essentially what happens is they're going to put that out for public solicitation. So the federal government typically will dictate where those price lines are. So anything over $250,000 goes out for public solicitation. Right? So every organization handles that a little bit differently, but the breakdown almost always goes, you have the owner organization. So that's whoever owns the project, that who owns the funds and is going to be hiring something for them. A prime contractor is the organization that they're contracting directly with,
Jenny,
right? So when Veronica mentioned that they don't typically have MWBE prime contractors, that is an artifact of the way the MWBE. Oh.
Yeah, I think we're gonna have to
just got a text saying my video is a little grainy. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you were starting to cut out.
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me okay though?
Yeah, we can hear you okay now.
Yeah.
Okay, let me just. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Because this is a very important topic. So you have the owner agency, that's whoever owns the money, right? Whoever is actually doing the project. The prime contractor is who they're directly contracting with. And this is where Veronica was referencing. We don't see a lot of MWBE prime contractors. It stands for minority or women-owned companies, right? So it is an artifact of the way that these programs were built, where there's a goal percentage, or there's a percentage goal, excuse me. So that's where you get tier 2. So when I say tier, that's who they're hiring, right? So typically you're going to see minority women-owned companies coming in on that second level. They're also called a subcontractor. The SBE program that Veronica mentioned is near and dear to my heart. I oversee that program with the school district I currently work with, but that's a priming program. So that allows us to work directly with community members and small diverse businesses. But that's the difference between a prime contractor and a subcontractor. I hope that provides some clarity, but I'm happy to dive deeper if needed.
I think what's really important is that in all these programs, a look at Denver in the last 15 or so years, we've lost a lot of contractors, Black and brown contractors, because they couldn't get work with the city or DIA or DPS or, RTD. And unfortunately, they've gone by the wayside, but there's a lot of them that still could be primes. And that's the real battle here, is trying to get, especially even with federal dollars. I mean, a lot of these folks are 8A firms. They're, they're certified for whatever, and you have to be certified to get work. But, struggling with the people that run these programs internally, they want to give the contracts to the same people over and over again. those are the Hensel Phelps, Mortensons, the huge construction firms. And so what you see are these subcontractors struggling to and fighting to be part of that, to be part of a joint venture or but in those contracts, the city, whoever we're dealing with, can write incentives into that to the contractors to include people of color. When we were working with DIA to get that hotel built and our work with the ACDBEs, sometimes the contract goals were up in the 40 percentile. And so there was a lot of minority participation when we were meeting with Kim Day, the director of DIA, every 2 weeks. And so that's what it takes. It's not easy, especially, for me, I was working full time with NewsEd, so I had to, make time in my schedule to do this very important work. And NewsEd, helped me with that. But it's something that needs to happen if you want this infrastructure money getting out into our communities. I don't know if there's anything written into the federal legislation about that. I mean, it would be nice if it would, because that's what makes these folks do things, is if they have the incentive to do them.
Veronica, if I could add to that, and I apologize, I have a weird delay going on right now, so my apologies if it's clipping just a second or two early or late. We have been identifying, I've been working with a couple of supplier diversity professionals. The evaluation criteria itself really needs to be revamped. So a lot of what I'm seeing in terms of those institutional barriers, those obstacles, comes from the way the evaluation processes are conducted in and of itself. When you're looking at experience that excludes the majority of contractors who aren't currently working within a certain field, that in and of itself is a barrier. If you are requiring certain brands of materials where a vendor needs to be a preferred customer to purchase that, and then you find out to be a preferred customer you need to purchase $1 million worth of product within a year, that's an institutional barrier. So not only looking at who is being hired, but why are they being hired? What does the evaluation process look like, and how can we advocate on behalf of the community members to really change up that criteria? Maybe you haven't worked with a school district in 5 years, but you've worked at a hospital, or you're doing commercial development for a neighborhood, and you've put in large mechanical systems that are equivalent to the type of systems that are going to be in this RFP. So not only changing the way the evaluation is done, but helping people understand how to work within the system that is currently feeding these opportunities. I shouldn't say feeding these opportunities, but continually creating an environment where individuals are repeatedly chosen. I do think that there's a lot of work we can do there. There is work that we can do not only on a local but state level that I think can help to protect our community. So it's a fascinating thing to dive into, but I don't think anyone would argue that we see the same names far too often. And part of the thing that I am trying to build in the local business community is how do we get that new blood into what can be a very intimidating environment.
Well, I really appreciate that. This conversation about, is installing something in one kind of public building that different than another public building? And it's like these devils are in the details that you're talking about. Veronica, you've had a chance to advocate for funds for housing development through HUD. You've also advocated for dollars that are local bonds to be spent back into communities. Are there any differences that you see between federal requirements compared to, say, local requirements?
Oh, it depends. If you've got federal dollars coming in, there's all kinds of requirements, Davis-Bacon and all that kind of stuff. But most of the dollars that come down through, the city or the state come from the federal dollars, and so they all have to comply with those regulations. No matter what they are. I don't know if DPS is a little different, or like health and hospitals. We CAF tried to go to health and hospitals and talk to them about their MWBE program. Well, they don't have one, and that was an absolute nightmare. That's a challenge that's in front of us. So I don't know what guidelines they follow. They don't seem to follow any guidelines, although they get city dollars. And so it just depends on the entity, Ian, and who you're dealing with. For example, DPS years ago, way before you were there, Jenny, that they had the bond money that we all voted on, and so when you looked at the contracts that were going out in our community, although the Black and brown population is huge in DPS, I think Latinos are 60%, and
Yeah, right around like 57%.
Less than 1% of those dollars, those bond dollars, went out to people of color contractors. Let me say that again, less than 1%. And that's when CAF went to them and said, no, you can't do this anymore. And those are pretty much bond monies that that we as citizens vote on, and they should have some regulation and guidelines on them, but they didn't. And as a result of that, that's what I was talking about, is we lost a lot of contractors, minority contractors, because they couldn't get any work. They couldn't get any work, not only at DPS, but other entities, whether they were quasi-public or whether they were, federal or state or local. Robert Alvarado, a really good friend of mine, a huge advocate for this kind of stuff, is always advocating for these firms to become 8A firms, because that, they have to give them work. But, the application is difficult. There needs to be some kind of process to help people get through that contract. It's expensive too. It's not a cheap, 8A is not cheap to apply for. You have to always be on the city and DIA and everybody to create mentorship programs and joint ventures. That helps build a contractor's ability to get more contracts. And you think that they would step forward and make one of these minority contractors a prime, but they don't do it. They just don't do it. And I know that out at the airport, they're starting to include the community more in some of these, particularly about concessionaires, interviewing them. So we work on it. I wish I could do this work full time. If I could do this work full time, I'd be in heaven, because this is what I enjoy doing. But we need a full-time person doing these things.
I hope you all don't mind, but I saw Esther here just dropping things in the chat about work that she does that's similar to yours in another state. And I just thought, wow, you all should be talking to each other, because you know what you're talking about. Esther, I saw you talked about these disadvantaged business enterprise programs. I don't know if maybe you want to describe that, but are you having the same issues where white women are predominantly taking these contracts?
That is what I have observed. So thank you for the opportunity, and I apologize for just jumping into this conversation. So I figured I would take my lunchtime during this time frame. The Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Program is a federally funded program. It was passed, the law passed in the early 1980s by a different name, but it has essentially become the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise. And the whole purpose of it was that with respect to transportation-related fields, it has been, historically, we have seen discrimination in the absence of women and minorities obtaining contracts into even subcontracts. And so the goal of this this federal law is to bring women and minority-owned businesses to the same level playing field of what has been predominantly a male-dominated, Caucasian male-dominated industry. And so one of the challenges from the inside that I have observed is staffing for the program. It depends on which state. So typically each state DOT has a DBE program. It might be housed under their equal employment opportunity office or their Office of Civil Rights. And then in some larger some larger states, there are other entities that are also involved in the certification. I think Veronica mentioned, and maybe Jennifer, you mentioned too, the MBE program. That's typically a state-developed program. The state I reside in does not have that. The only certification that we have available is the DBE program. One of the challenges that I see is that we do outreach events, but the outreach events are actually geared towards a specific audience. We did a bilingual outreach event in February of 2020, and we had about 30 people. I ended up doing a bilingual presentation. And then the other thing that I noticed is the paperwork associated with seeking certification becomes a bit daunting for folks. So I think there are opportunities to do some things within a program, but I think it's very important for everyone that is participating in today's discussion here that with the infrastructure funds, there are requirements for seeking and bringing in women-owned, minority-owned businesses as subcontractors or as prime contractors for these projects that are being proposed.
Great. That's good.
That is such critical information. And if I could just add one thing that I think is also really important for the audience, make sure you're aware of which certification you're pursuing. So as Esther mentioned, there are costs associated, and Veronica, I think you mentioned this as well. There are costs associated, and there are resource guides out there. And what I'll do is we put together a resource guide here locally that has like our state information. So please disregard state and city information unless you're here in the Denver area. But it does state, like it shows all of like the federal programs, requirements, national certifications, and their requirements. The other thing that comes how often you need to renew your certification. So please keep an eye on that. It can hinder your ability to successfully bid on projects if there's that requirement on that project. We're seeing longer certification times because there is this influx of revenue into these different programs. Everyone is seeking to pull from the same certification pools. And so you're seeing that bottleneck in the actual certification process. But this is something that I think is incredibly important because I have unfortunately seen on more than one occasion a well-intended business led down the wrong path. And they spend a lot of time, effort, and money. And by the time that they've concluded that process and, you know, been very patient through that process, unfortunately, I might have to tell them that it's the incorrect certification. So make sure you're reaching out and you're doing your research and ask those questions before you go down that path. And if there's multiple certifications you're interested in, I always encourage the businesses I'm working with to look at the 5 top people you would want to work with in your best reality. Who would be your 5 people and what are they looking for? Because typically that's going to be your best effort to seek the certifications. But thank you so much, Esther. It's incredibly important. DBE, SBE, MBE. We live in the alphabet soup in this world. So thank you very much.
And I do want to point out the DBE program is free. You should never pay to apply. It is free. And the 8A program, the Small Business Administration, and this other organization called the Procurement Technical Assistance Centers, which are located in each state, typically associated possibly with the university, at least they are in the state I reside in. They also provide some free assistance.
Yeah, I think I've seen a lot of in our community, Latinos that became 8A firms years ago, and it built wealth for them, extreme wealth. And it cost them up front, but it's important that we find resources to help these businesses become 8A firms. I know that when Trump was president, it kind of didn't hear about it much anymore, but now that the Democrats are back in, I'm sure it's going to become a strong program again. And I would really recommend that businesses, and I do recommend that to businesses, even nonprofit housing groups or community development corporations can become 8A firms. So it's just not private sector businesses.
Can I just add one last thing? Just because, I mean, all of this is so important. One thing I have kind of noticed as an aside, Davis Bacon wages, or what we call prevailing wages on federal projects. It is so important for our communities, specifically our communities of color, to know that if they are on a federal project, they should be getting federal wages. I cannot tell you how common it is at times to learn that folks have not been paid their proper wages.
Yep, that's true.
Yeah, wage theft is
Unfortunately,
so terrible.
Although that I know that we did a couple of projects where we had to pay Davis Bacon, and boy, the city was on us all the time, and we had to report all the time on the money that was going out for Davis Bacon. So Denver's pretty good about overseeing that. I don't know about other states or cities, but yeah, it's important that you pay Davis Bacon for sure.
Now, Esther, where is it that you keep saying your state? Where are you joining us from?
Idaho.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I've had a chance to visit there before. Beautiful. What a beautiful state.
It is. It's great. I do have one other comment about Justice 40. I encourage everybody to please, to the extent possible, participate in the Justice 40. I shouldn't say every, but it's my understanding all federal agencies are supposed to be looking at this. And so far, what I've seen is USDOT and the EPA. I've seen some activity on that front. So we need our voices at the table there.
Talk a little bit about the Justice 40, Esther.
Actually, Ian, I'm happy to, but maybe I know there were other folks that have talked about it. So if there's anybody else who wants to talk about it.
I started out a little bit in the beginning, but I think your perspective on the EJ40 is certainly welcome.
Well, I'll speak specifically to USDOT. So USDOT had two webinars in November on Justice 40. So the Biden administration is implementing this Justice 40 initiative, and it's my understanding every federal agency is supposed to undertake it. And the way that USDOT appears to be undertaking it through their webinars is they held one webinar where they asked specific questions, and it was very interactive. So you had to sign on to like a website, and then they would ask a question, and then you would vote or select. And that actually ranged from, it was questions about economic opportunity, about infrastructure, whether that was roadways, impacts like sidewalks, transit. They wanted the public's input on where the focus and the emphasis should be. And then on the EPA Justice 40, the only webinar that I've seen has been specific to tribes in what it would be considered Region 10, and Colorado, I think, it's in another region. EPAs that I've seen so far has not been as interactive as USDOT's, where they wanted to hear from the communities. Like, okay, 40. So essentially, Veronica, in short, 40% of the funds to do work in communities would be going back to those communities. So vulnerable communities to address, and anyone else, please speak up. To create some economic opportunity as well.
Oh, you're hitting it right on the head. And a huge part of that, and why we decided to have this talk, was to ensure that not only were the projects built in our communities, but that we were passing that wealth on into our community. So we're reaching the end of our time here. I know that we got a few minutes started late, so I don't know if the three of you would love to hear what you have to say too. If there's any one last message you'd like to leave the people with before people head on over to another session.
Go ahead, Jenny.
Sure. I actually just had a resource I wanted to share with the community. So there's been a lot of conversation during this session, which has been wonderful. It has been so great to hear the different perspectives and different programs. A lot of what I hear as that like main barrier is bonding or insurance, right? So when you get into like these infrastructure projects, when you're looking to access these types of opportunities, it is almost always just like a brick wall. There is a program through the SBA. It's the Small Business Bonding Program, and they will guarantee 80% of your bonds. So a lot of what we see in the diverse business community is that, I mean, traditionally we just don't trust banks as much, or, you know, like we may not have like the same financial records, or they don't look the same as a majority owned company, and banks want to see all of that documentation. So the SBA will help you go through that process. And they also utilize your lines of credit as part of your liquidation. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the differences between insurance and bonding, it can be incredibly difficult, and it can be something that is a real a barrier. So please do check out those programs. There are going to be state representatives all across the country. I have the state information here for Colorado. They have bonding agents already set aside to work with you. And if you are currently a federally certified company, they will guarantee 90% of your bond. I have seen this be a very successful resource, and the difference between diverse companies actually getting a job or just completely being discredited. So thank you so much for having me today. This has been a pleasure. I am so incredibly excited to hear about all the wonderful work and look forward to seeing these infrastructure projects starting to hit the ground.
I think that Jenny is right about the bonding. That'll knock a contractor out in a second if they don't have access to bonding. And that's really a critical piece about this whole thing that everybody, all these agencies need to look at out at DIA, DPS. And there's no reason why they can't get bonded. There's just no reason. And that's been a block. And all these little things, like you were saying, Jenny, with DPS, if you haven't done anything in 5 years, I mean, they just have silly rules to keep people of color out of contracts. And it doesn't make any sense. And, when you're dealing with them all the time, it's just like, it's really difficult to get them to change their rules. And I think a lot of times the only thing that gets them to change their rules is a lawsuit. And that really scares the hell out of them. I know that Denver got sued for their MWBE program. It scared Mayor Webb, and so he dropped the whole program. Went to the Supreme Court, and they said, yes, you can have an MWE program. The fire department didn't hire a black person for 7 years because they're afraid they were going to get sued. But the city charter says they can go down the list and do that. So you have to be vigilant everywhere when you're working, just not with contractors, but, within our own police departments and fire departments, and making sure that our people are getting hired. Because we need people of color out on the streets. We're growing like crazy. And so thank you for having us today. You've had a wonderful conference. I love Green Latinos. You do a lot of good work in our community, and thank you.
And I guess maybe the one piece of advice that I would like to share is we all live in our communities, and we undoubtedly know minority-owned firms in our communities. Reach out and encourage them to consider doing work with the government. It's daunting, but if folks ever have any questions, they can always go to the Disadvantaged Business Enterprise Programs. I'm not sure about Colorado, if that's still under the Transportation Department or if it's under a separate entity. It might still be under Transportation. But reach out to the DBE programs. Because I'm like in Idaho, I'm here to help. And quite frankly, I've often thought about just spending my summers driving around the neighborhoods and stopping and chatting up with the folks working on construction sites to better understand like what's going on, Are these small businesses already? Are people considering a small business? If so, what are the resources available, right? Because at the end of the day, small business is what creates sustainable and economic opportunity in our communities.
Well, thank you so much to all three of you. I think, Esther, I wish I would have known you before. Maybe you should have been one of the people moderating this instead of me. But I'm so happy to hear that there were others here in Green Latinos that are connected to this work. We're going to continue to having these conversations, as you heard from Mayor Pete and everybody else. This is the year of infrastructure. This is the decade of infrastructure. And so if we want to make sure these dollars come back to our communities, it takes you and you talking to your neighbors and you organizing and encouraging them to participate. Thank you again. And I want to let everybody go on to your next session.